The action in Little House on the Prairie takes place in southeastern Kansas on the Osage Diminished Indian Reserve. Charles and Caroline Ingalls moved their family into what Wilder identifies as Indian Territory in late 1869, when Wilder herself was about 2.5 years old. To put things in perspective, the American Civil War had ended just 4 years earlier in April 1865. Before the outbreak of the war, and then over the course of the next 4 years, violence had raged along the Missouri-Kansas border, pitting slaveholders in Missouri against abolitionists in Kansas. From John Brown's raid on Missouri slaveholders in 1858, through William Quantrill's attack on abolitionists in Lawrence, Kansas in 1863, and the random acts of violence that continued until Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox in 1865, the Missouri-Kansas border was fluid and often dangerous. After the war, veterans and their families, displaced or uprooted by this conflict, swarmed over the Missouri border into Osage lands in Kansas. This is the environment into which Charles and Caroline Ingalls plunged their family in late 1869. As we've discussed earlier, it's unclear whether the Ingalls family moved to Indian Territory from the big woods of Wisconsin or from north central Missouri, where Charles and his brother-in-law Henry Quinner had purchased property in 1868. But given the general pattern of settlement onto Osage lands in the late 1860s, it could very well be that the family moved there from Missouri. What we do know for certain is that the Ingalls family, Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, and infant Caroline Celestia, born just days before the census taker visited their home, were living in Montgomery County, Kansas, on August 13, 1870. As we've already discussed, the census taker misspelled the family surname and identified Charles as a carpenter with an estimate of $200 for their personal estate. I'm going to repeat this quote about the family's real estate value because I think it's really important in this context. The census taker left the column blank for the value of the family's real estate, as he did for all the settlers he counted in this part of Montgomery County. The lands belonged to the Osage Indians, and settlers had no title to said lands. Wilder doesn't provide a reason in Pioneer Girl to explain her parents' decision to occupy land in Indian Territory. In Little House on the Prairie, Wilder explains Pa's motivations only toward the end of the novel, just before the family is forced to leave. If some blasted politicians in Washington hadn't sent out word it would be all right to settle here, I'd never have been 3 miles over the line in Indian Territory. So what do we know about the Osage Diminished Reserve, the native people who lived there, and the situations that threatened their continued possession of the land? In a series of treaties with the United States from 1808 until 1825, the Osage people ceded lands they had traditionally held in what is now Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, as more and more settlers moved west. Part of the Osage people's land was also set aside by the United States for the Cherokee Nation. Under a treaty dating from 1825, the Osage Reserve was created and the land was to remain in Osage possession so long as they chose to occupy same. The major point to remember here is that Osage landholdings dwindled in the 19th century, and in 1865, as Civil War veterans swarmed onto their lands, the Osages sold the eastern part of their reserve to the United States and settled onto what became known as the Osage Diminished Reserve. It was a narrow strip of land about 50 miles wide and 125 miles long. This action did virtually nothing to stop the flow of, from the Osage people's perspective, intruders onto their land. As the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Atchison, Kansas observed in 1867, Nothing less than a military force would suffice to keep American settlers off the Osage Reserve. In 1868, facing extreme physical and economic hardships, the Osage people signed yet another treaty, this time agreeing to sell their land in southern Kansas to the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. The Osage people came to regret this decision, and Congress refused to ratify the treaty. But the mere prospect of this sale, whether to the railroad or to the United States government, sent more intruders surging over the Missouri border and onto the Osage Diminished Reserve. Charles and Caroline Ingalls were part of this movement. They settled, as we've already seen, in Montgomery County, near the Vidaigre River and not far from Independence, Kansas, 13 miles, not 40 miles away, as Wilder remembered it in Pioneer Girl and Little House on the Prairie. As one historian points out, certainly Independence and Montgomery County were illegal, since they were both organized and recognized by the state of Kansas before the Osage title was extinguished. As for the Osage people themselves, when the Ingalls family crossed into Kansas in 1869, Osage villages were clustered near the Vidaigre River, and a 19th century historian, writing just 12 years after the Ingalls family left the reserve, estimated about 3,600 Osage Indians lived on the reserve in the late 1860s. In other words, a significant Osage population lived in close proximity to the real Ingalls family. In fact, the family's little house was just 2 to 3 miles from one of the Osage camps. As for the tensions during this period, alarmed at this bold step on the part of settlers to intrude upon and occupy their territory, the Indians began to protest further invasion and attempted to prohibit immigration from crossing the Vidaigre, but to no purpose. Another historian, writing just 3 years after the publication of Little House on the Prairie, noted that conditions in Kansas were apparently becoming intolerable for the Osages. Their crops were destroyed by herds of cattle and other stock belonging to white settlers, and lawless white men stole their horses and robbed their corn cribs. In 1870, the Indian agent at the Osage Diminished Reserve reported that settlers completely destroyed an Osage village, home to 900 people, because intruders wanted that particular site for themselves. But how reliable are Wilder's memories in Little House on the Prairie, and even Pioneer Girl for that matter? She was not yet 3 years old when the family moved to Indian Territory, and just 4 years old when they left. Let's start with the scene in Little House on the Prairie when 2 Osage men enter the Ingalls house while Pa is away. Several anecdotal accounts from Kansas settlers during this period report similar encounters with Osage people, usually men. In fact, according to one 19th century historian, settlers were obliged to secure consent from the Indians before occupying a squatter's claim, and that Osage men made frequent visits to their tenants' property to ensure ongoing payment in one form or another. There's no record that Charles Ingalls made such an agreement with nearby Osage leaders, but it's possible those 2 men Wilder described in Little House on the Prairie hoped to secure one from him. And in the original version of Pioneer Girl, Wilder referred not just to one such visit, but to several. She wrote that Indians came often to the house. Another important point here. The Osage people were impoverished and hungry during their last days on the reserve in Kansas. Shortly before the Civil War, the federal government stopped making its annuity payments to the Osage people. This, coupled with the violence and devastation of the Civil War on the Kansas-Missouri border, had left the Osage Nation on the verge of extinction. So the Osage people began to take what they needed from those they viewed as trespassers. Undoubtedly, Osage Indians visited the Ingalls family regularly. Wilder's childhood memories of those visits are indeed supported by the historical record. But what about the big events in Little House on the Prairie? The events in the chapter Indian War Cry and Indians Right Away, for example. In recent years, Wilder has come under attack for her depiction of those terrible war cries that came again and again. Historian Francis W. Kay maintains that at best, Wilder misunderstood the nature of the Osage encampment near the family's cabin. Kay believes the nearby Osage encampment was peaceful. The sounds Wilder and her families overheard were part of traditional Osage ceremonies asking for success on their buffalo hunt, or Osage women mourning their leader's decision to permanently leave the reserve in Kansas. Cultural misunderstanding and panic, Kay reasons, caused the family and their neighbors to overreact to cries coming from the Osage camp. But Wilder rearranged her memories of life in Indian territory for Little House on the Prairie. She placed the Indian War Cry chapter toward the end of the book, just before the Osage people leave Indian territory and just before the family itself does. The sequence implies that the conflict came during 1871. The events unfold differently in Pioneer Girl, and they correspond to the historical escalation of hostilities between the Osage people and settlers living on Indian lands. The war dances, Wilder remembered from her childhood, probably took place in the late winter or early spring of 1870, before Carrie Ingalls was born later that year in August. In January 1870, Osage agent Isaac Gibson wrote the superintendent of Indian Affairs that the Osages could massacre the inhabitants of this valley in a few hours, and if they should be done to do so this spring, I should not be surprised. The superintendent agreed. If the Osages and settlers continue to live side by side on the reserve, he wrote, war may result therefrom. Another important point. The Ingalls cabin was located near Walnut Creek, and Agent Gibson wrote that he had received reports of the Osages assuming a hostile stance near the mouth of Walnut Creek in mid-January 1870. So again, the historical record supports Wilder's memories, but not the chronology of her novel. As for the departure of the Osage Nation from Kansas, most historians agree that the Osage in Kansas left the reserve in June 1870 for their annual buffalo hunt, and that some returned in March 1871. Others went directly from the hunt to their new reserve in what is now Oklahoma. Pioneer Girl seems to follow the same sequence of events. In the late summer of 1870, Pa takes Laura and Mary to an abandoned Indian camp. Wilder, by the way, fictionalized this episode in Little House on the Prairie. And when they return to the house, they discover they have a new sister, Carrie, born in August of that year. More about her birth in a few minutes. Later in Pioneer Girl, Wilder writes that then the Indians came back. The implication? They went away for the hunt, then they returned. But what about the dramatic scene in Little House on the Prairie where Laura watches the Indians ride away on their pretty ponies? According to historian Lewis Burns, not all the Osage people left Kansas permanently after the buffalo hunt of 1870-1871. Others returned to Kansas to salvage what they could of their possessions. Since the Ingalls family lived on a well-traveled Indian trail, it's possible that the Wilders' memories stem from this slice of history in the spring of 1871. Or it's possible that Wilder remembered an earlier migration, when in the autumn of 1870, after Carrie's birth, Indian agent Isaac Gibson led smaller parties of Osages from Kansas into Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. What is ultimately important in the context of Little House on the Prairie, however, is that Wilder rearranged the sequence of events to tell a better story, to build toward an exciting climax and satisfying resolution of the novel.